research notes series hosted by the Resources, Environment and Development Program in the Crawford School of Public Policy. This event will be recorded and later uploaded on the event webpage. My name is Mousami Prasad, and I am a research fellow at Crawford School. Today, we are happy to host Dr. Sango Mahanty, who is professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. She is a human geographer who currently studies the politics of green economies, frontier markets, and dramatic nature-society transformation in mainland Southeast Asia. Today, Professor Mahanty will present highlights from a collaborative paper on Rupture, dramatic nature-society transformations associated with hydropower. This work has been supported by the Australian Research Council. In today's talk, Sango will discuss their Rupture analytic and how it helps to expose the complex temporal, spatial, and generative dimensions of adverse forms of environmental change. Please feel free to make comments and raise questions in the chat box, which will be answered in the end at the webinar. Over to you, Sango.
Thank you so much, Mousami. And can I just say, it's really lovely to see all these wonderful faces, even though we're all in Zoom after kind of our lockdown. And I'm actually speaking to you from the office today, which is very nice. So I'd also like to just start by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose unceded lands I'm speaking from today. And as Mousami mentioned, today's talk comes from a paper that is very much a joint effort with the colleagues who are listed here on the slide. And I think quite a few of them are here today with us. So yeah, each of us in this research group comes with a very deep research background in mainland Southeast Asia. And in this region for more than a decade, some of us for quite a bit more than a decade, have been witnessing quite intense transformations, environmental and social. And we were drawn to the term rupture in Christian Lund's paper from 2016 as a way of thinking about these transformations. Lund uses the term rupture to describe dramatic moments of institutional and structural disruption, like you might see in periods of intense conflict or revolution. And he suggests that these kinds of events create new spaces of negotiation, and so they represent open moments that have uncertain risks and opportunities. Anthropologists are also using the term rupture to describe sudden social disruptions or discontinuities. So we found this concept of rupture resonated with the kinds of major shifts that we've been seeing in the nature society realm as well. And in our project, we're working to elaborate and translate this concept for broader application to these nature society relationships that we've been observing. There are, of course, other literatures that speak to kind of related ideas of environmental disruption or crisis. For example, Anthropocene thinking observes major environmental change at a planetary scale. And there's been sort of qualifications and critiques around some of those observations. And more recent work on the Anthropocene from a humanities perspective tends to take a more situated approach. For example, Anna Singh's idea of the patchy Anthropocene. And she talks about how there are nodes of intense environmental and social disruption rather than kind of an undifferentiated or flat kind of pattern of global change. The other important area for us is Marxist analytics that have been really useful in exposing the drivers of crisis within capitalism's extractive relationships and the unequal outcomes that are associated with that. And political ecologists often explore these kinds of themes within specific landscapes and contexts. The other main field that I think has informed our work is disaster studies, where recent ideas talk about, or recent work talks about how disasters are co-produced by physical and social processes rather than just being kind of natural disasters, as we've talked about them in the past. So much more can be said on each of these bodies of work, But just to note that these fields have informed our formulation of rupture, and I'm not going to go into them in more detail today, although we do in the paper that is currently under review. But today I'd like to really spend most of my time unpacking this concept of rupture more with you. And really in our work, we're using rupture in two ways. First, we use it to describe an episode of dramatic change in nature and society that has uncertain and also catalytic outcomes. And second, we've developed a rupture, or what we call a rupture analytic, that helps us to understand some key aspects of these change processes and their implications. Okay, so this map shows the locations of our case studies. As political ecologists, our approach to studying these processes is situated or in place. So we're studying hydropower dams as specific examples of rupture. Through these case studies, we're trying to explore how specific episodes of rupture sit within broader socio-political and landscape transformations. And we're studying local responses as well as linkages to the national, regional, and global level. In the interest of time, I won't run through each of these cases, but I'll just make some general points. So all of these projects are in frontier settings where major land use transformations are underway. Indigenous communities are usually affected. And also these are countries with authoritarian or illiberal governance. Members of our team have a longitudinal perspective on some of these cases, especially the two in Vietnam, where Hirsch, my colleague, has worked for many years. The Atari Dam in Cambodia, where Sarah Milne has worked before, and Tân Him Bun in Laos, where Barney has worked. And this longitudinal knowledge really helps to fill out our understanding of some of the historical interactions that I've been talking about. I'll move now to the core themes of this rupture analytic that I'm going to focus on, which really grew from a combination of our conceptual reading and thinking and our empirical work. So these themes are the temporality of rupture, the spatial material relationships involved, and also ways of thinking about the generative potential of rupture episodes. And although I'm presenting them as kind of three discrete themes, please keep in mind that the themes are actually very closely related to each other, and there are areas of overlap as we go through. Starting with temporality, any observation of change involves an implicit timescale. And although the concept of rupture, as Lund or some of the other scholars that I cited earlier have been using it from anthropology, they talk about it as a sudden shift or a discrete event. We find that rupture is not necessarily smooth or linear or rapid. And this is why we find it more productive to think about rupture as an episode that has fuzzy edges, and it tends to merge with long-term and ongoing transformations. You could also think of these as cascading changes over time. And people may also interpret and respond to these temporalities in different ways. So social and cultural conceptions of time. So this is from a case from Vietnam. Vietnam's Hoa Binh Dam was built over 15 years between 1979 and 1994. So that's a 15-year timeframe already for construction that we're looking at. And Hoa Binh was Vietnam's first major dam project during the post-conflict state building years, so it's significant in various ways. The ethnic Muang, Dai, Thai and Zhao villages who lived in the valley that was inundated by the 200-kilometre long reservoir had to be resettled when the dam was built. And during resettlement, these groups were given land in quite remote and what they saw as being quite uncultivable areas. Rather than move the villagers to these new areas, the villagers claimed land at the edge of the reservoir. And then they rebuilt their villages there during the 1980s. But over time, many social, political and economic changes have subsequently impacted these communities as well. There was hyperinflation during the mid-1980s, which effectively kind of erased the value of the compensation they received from the dam. There were food shortages after their paddy land was flooded by the reservoir during the 1980s and early 90s. And then in the 1990s, there was collectivization of land in Vietnam, which further disrupted their farming arrangements again. And then in recent years, young people are leaving to seek off-farm employment. Plus there's ongoing market intensification, which kind of brings new forms of market engagement, for instance, cage fishing initiatives on the reservoir. So in the Hua Bin case, the dam's impacts were really amplified by these cascading changes and by pressures of state neglect, land conflict, migration, and now growing levels of household debt and social inequality. So from the perspective of local communities, the dam instigated rupture was a significant event, but it was really only part of a continual process of change that they are grappling with. So the slow timeline of changes around Hua Bin contrasts with the sudden collapse of the Sepian Senam Noi Saddle Dam in Laos in 2018. This relatively rapid event discharged around 350 million cubic meters of water down the Bolaven Plateau, and many have depicted this as a sudden wall of water that kind of washed across this plateau. But even here, the temporality, when you start to look more closely, is a bit more diffuse. Several hours elapsed between when the dam broke and when the flood wave reached these nearby villages. And one villager in an impacted district reported that the water rose slowly at first, which gave people a little bit of time to call for their household members, to perhaps collect a few belongings, or to get into boats before the full force of the wave hit them. But the risks were accentuated because state authorities failed to provide a timely warning through the mobile phone network. In the village of Ban Mai, at least 8 people were reportedly killed during this time. The flood then spread over the following days to a much larger area and across the border into Cambodia, prompting evacuations even in those bordering districts of Cambodia. And then later, even as far downstream as the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, farmers observed a flood pulse. So this seemingly sudden event played out over hours, over days and weeks. And the dam breach was also framed by prior actions like decisions about poor construction materials, lack of preparation for this kind of event, and a failure to warn and evacuate downstream communities as soon as the dam breach occurred. And as this article on the right shows, some years on, people are still coping with the impacts of this. The effects of the dam breach have been accentuated by slow and poorly coordinated government responses, even with significant foreign aid and a sizable insurance payout. The Lao government has also clamped down on or dismissed critical civil society voices, which then limits the scope for advocacy and remedial action. So as cases of rupture, Hua Bin Dam in northern Vietnam and this dam breach at Sepian Senam Noi in southern Laos seem to follow very different timelines, but both cases highlight the diffuse temporal edges of rupture episodes when you try and look at the origins and the outcomes of those episodes. Still on temporality, I mentioned before the need to consider diverse views of times, which can shape how people interpret and respond to change. For instance, here, the Indigenous and minority communities impacted by Mekong dams may mark time through long, non-linear cycles of seasonality, or even see past, present, and future as coexisting in place. So in this example, Indigenous Benong villagers who live near the Lower Se San 2 Dam in Cambodia initially interpreted the flooding of the dam reservoir through the lens of seasonality. A young woman from the inundated village of Kabal Rumia explained that the water rose over a few days in a similar pattern to their annual rainy season floods. They expected the water to retreat in 3 or 4 days and took their animals to a hill to wait for this retreat to happen. But then after some days, they realized that the flooding was an enduring, or what she called a forever change, rather than part of their familiar seasonal cycle. And the following year, the dry season saw the reservoir retreat again and re-expose parts of the previously flooded village, which is what's in the background photo there. So as villagers found themselves able to visit parts of their old village again, for instance, to harvest coconut, they then started to read again a new kind of seasonality into the reservoir. So the first two examples show how seemingly dramatic or punctuated episodes of change still interact with these long-term and slow transitions that then serve to accentuate impacts and intensify uncertainty. They also touched on the role of political and economic inequalities that I'll come back to. And the last example on seasonal patterns here points to how different perceptions of time can feed into diverse interpretations of change and also shape people's responses. Okay, I'm moving on now to spatial and material relationships, which is the second theme that I'd flagged. In her influential book titled For Space, which some of you will know closely, geographer Dr Mousami wrote that space is a core facet of human existence. It's interactive, has multiplicity, and is always in construction. At our study sites, the adverse outcomes of dam construction and resettlement were seeded and accentuated by ongoing land transformations. And these included processes of state territorialization, planned and unplanned resettlement for other reasons, migration, market intensification, and resource extraction, especially timber. The Atari Dam Case from Western Cambodia provides an example of some of these kinds of interactions. So here, conservation interventions from the early 2000s already enclosed large areas of forest before the dam was built. Then construction of the dam ramped up illicit timber extraction during the dam construction process and further displaced the ethnic Chong communities whose access to resources had already been confined through the protected area designations previously. Then when our colleague Tim Phuc conducted fieldwork in these communities in January 2020, the initial impacts of the dam seemed like a distant memory compared with the more immediate and pressing land transformations that had followed. There were upgrades to road access during dam construction, which brought in migrants, speculators, tourists, and investors who saw the area's potential for cash crop development. Land was quickly acquired by well-connected Khmer investors for cash crops like bananas, pepper, and fruit trees, some of which are in the pictures here. And these processes in turn brought further settlers and seasonal labourers. And then the most recent squeeze came from a REDD+ project designed to sell carbon credits in global carbon markets and led by international conservation NGOs. So this project has really ramped up patrolling of villages' informal forest access and use and sort of curbed their access to land for swidden cultivation and agroforestry. So here we can see that cascading changes before and after dam construction were really crucial in reworking social and property relations as well as environmental conditions. So as Mousami suggests, this space of rupture was interactive and it was continually under construction. The Xuan Laos case in Vietnam also revealed these kinds of complex spatial and material interactions. When the dam was built between 2005 and 2011, sip of water. The neighbouring ethnic Thai villages were resettled. In 2008, the state-owned Vietnam Rubber Group introduced rubber production into the area with support from a national poverty alleviation program. With state support, the company used a contract farming model to engage villagers in rubber cultivation on their resettlement lands. And this was at a time when villagers were also grappling with the effects of resettlement. Their farming contracts fixed land into rubber production, and it prevented villagers from growing food or other cash crops. And later, when the rubber price slumped, the villagers weren't able to redeploy their land to grow other crops. Instead, they were left without an income from rubber, but also unable to grow food crops. Some villagers started to fight back by planting fruit trees on that land to try and lay claim to some of the land that the rubber company had taken over. But the Vietnam Rubber Group has very strong government backing and proved to be quite a tough opponent in this regard. So these interactions, historical interactions, have left villagers with entrenched debt, and many young people are leaving the village now for off-farm work. So in both the Atari and Xuan La cases, the dams in themselves bring dramatic environmental and social impacts, but it's these synergistic changes that seem to really deepen or intensify the impacts, the rupture, if you like. So both cases also highlight the key role that's been played by state and elite actors in these land dispossession and extractive activities. So through these kinds of interactions, spaces of rupture start to mirror and reproduce social and political inequalities. Massey's concept of multiplicity or heterogeneity in spatial relations suggests that space is simultaneously engaged and interpreted in different ways by different actors. And our analytical choices are important in making certain processes visible and in making others less visible or even invisible. And scale of analysis is a key example here. In this regional map, for instance, we get a sense of the massive dam investment in recent years in this part of the world, and in line with national and regional geopolitical agendas. And these collectively form what some are calling a transnational hydropower complex. But a sole focus at this much larger scale can render some important relationships invisible. For instance, the Mekong River Commission ran a strategic assessment process to study transboundary issues across the basin, but they didn't consider ongoing processes of landscape change of the kind that I was talking about, or the importance of local commons that people use for their everyday needs and that serve as safety nets during periods of stress. An emphasis on national and regional interactions can also run the risk of representing states as unitary actors, but in practice there are often competing interests between national and subnational levels of government or agencies when it comes to these major infrastructure projects. So multiplicity calls for us to think across scales when we look at rupture. Aside from those regional and national dynamics that I just mentioned, we need to consider local dynamics as well, such as the experiences of villagers as they attempt to adapt and reorganize their lives around new hydrological realities. So, for instance, in the Hin Boon Valley, this included abandoning wet season rice production on the riverside and moving into upland rice crops or cash crops. And these kinds of adaptations, which were relevant across most of the study sites, involve new livelihood challenges, uncertainties, and risks. Multiplicity also calls for us to attend to diverse lived experiences of rupture, which I'll talk about next. Okay, so I'm moving now into generative potential, the third theme that I had flagged at the beginning. I spoke earlier about rupture as an open moment where existing power relations can be exposed and institutions can be reworked. But efforts to resist and reimagine existing institutions can also be met with reassertions of existing power relations. So rupture's generative potential is this interplay between catalytic opportunities and constraints. And importantly, in the illiberal and unequal political economies of the Mekong, not the only part of the world that has unequal political economies by any means, it's important to keep in mind that generative is not the same as transformative, and that lived experiences of rupture are also central to local responses. So I'll start there. These lived experiences are often strongly emotional. The Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht coined the term solastalgia to describe the profound sense of grief that people can feel when their familiar and special places are transformed. And at many of our study sites, these kinds of emotions were very close to the surface. At Lower Sessan too, Indigenous Penong communities expressed a deep sense of loss when their ancestral burial grounds and familiar landscapes were flooded by the dam reservoir. One community elder explained that he refused to resettle because he wanted to die in the place where his ancestors were buried. In Vietnam, the Indigenous Thai villages affected by the Sơn La Dam had very close inter-village ties through kin relationships, and their displacement deeply impacted these relationships. So more than a decade after the dam was built, villagers still held very strong attachments to their old village. An elderly man said that he dreamed of the old village quite often, even though it was now deep underwater. And he shared, every time I passed the location of the old village, I cried. I'm still afraid of passing this area as I cannot control my feelings. Another villager spoke of his heartbreak in demolishing their houses before moving. We all cried desperately when we had to do it. Communities affected by the Thern Him Bun Dam and the Sepian Senam Noi Dam collapse had similar accounts of psychological trauma and grief, and often with a similarly immobilizing effect to what was seen in Sơn La. In the case of Lower Sessan too, these deeply emotional responses seem to galvanize very active resistance by some members of the community. Several of the old Kabal Rumia villagers who remained near their original flooded village spoke of strong feelings of anger and indignation at their dislocation by the dam. And these feelings fueled strong community protest and opposition to the dam in the face of kind of daily intimidation by the military as well as other state agencies and actors. Rather than demolish and use materials from their flooded house to re-establish themselves, they chose to leave the entire flooded village in its place as a memorial to their lived experience and to their determination to stay nearby on their customary lands rather than move to the government-designated resettlement village. This kind of direct resistance was also visible in the Atari Dam Case in Cambodia, where site-based direct action was supported by regional and international civil society networks. These were also relevant in the Sessan 2 case to elevate impact. So these cases illustrate kind of an ambiguous role for emotions, where in the earlier cases, there was kind of an immobilizing effect, and in these later cases, kind of they serve to galvanize resistance and actions. So while the Areng and Lower Sessan 2 cases drew direct protest, it's important to note that resistance can also take more indirect forms, as James Scott indicates in his work on peasants' offstage tactics that he calls weapons of the weak, a classic book from 1985. And this is especially so in the authoritarian context of mainland Southeast Asia, where direct challenges to ruling parties can involve significant risk. And we saw that in the case of the Lower Sessan 2 protests. So in these kinds of settings, contention and resistance may be channeled through more informal political spaces. And political scientist Ben Kerkvliet shows that these everyday forms of resistance, quiet forms of non-compliance with official policy and orders, are really a key strand of politics in this region. And these kinds of hidden and subtle political dynamics were evident in our case study sites. For instance, after the Sepian Senam Noi Dam collapse in Laos, some families returned to clean their homes and to re-establish their destroyed villages against state instructions. These residents did not remain passive, waiting for compensation in the dam refugee camps. Similarly, at both Lower Sessan 2 and Hua Bin, the villagers decided to relocate to a site of their own choosing usually financed by themselves, through their own resources and labour, rather than be dictated as to where to move by the state authorities. Both these direct and indirect forms of agencies or expressions of agency can subsequently be overshadowed by state crackdowns or co-option. One example of this is in the use of social media, which is an essential new dimension in many Southeast Asian resource struggles. In Cambodia, social media platforms like Facebook were used to increase rural-urban networking and to mobilise Indigenous communities to protest against the Atari Dam, and as well as other threats like resource extraction and logging. These online protest movements became a powerful force that the dominant Cambodian People's Party then tried to constrain by jailing protesters for their Facebook posts in 2018 and 2020. And finally, what if generative potential goes beyond resistance to pursuing new imagined possibilities? So this image comes from Old Kabarumia, the community that I've touched on a few times now that refused to relocate. And these were posters prepared with NGO assistants that were displayed in the community meeting space, which basically present an imagined future as a cultural village. And integral to their plan was a claim for around 7,500 hectares of customary land, which they lodged in 2019. And this is a provision under Cambodia's Land Act. Now their 7,500 hectares was subsequently pared back by provincial authorities to a much smaller area of around 700 hectares, which I guess is another example of state pushback, as I was just talking about. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that their land claim was integral to kind of a larger vision of living as a relatively autonomous community with secure rights to their customary lands, as another example of Rupture's generative potential. Okay, so wrapping up now, this is my last slide. So I hope I've been able to just give you a very brief sense of this concept of rupture as an emplaced way of thinking about episodes of dramatic change. We face ever more frequent and intense episodes of nature-society disruption, whether we're talking about mega infrastructure projects of the kind that we've been studying in this ARC project, or more kind of localized experiences like Australia's Black Summer fires. And our concept of rupture is really seeking to locate these specific episodes within cascading changes that are underway in nature and society. And it's through these place-based connections that these interactive change processes become visible. Our findings also complicate the notion of rupture as a specific moment of breakage and invites us to think more deeply about the complex temporalities of rupture episodes, their spatial and material interactions, and the diverse kinds of generative potential that they might bring and that play out in very different ways over time. So I might leave it there. Thanks very much for your time and attention. And I'd be happy to take any questions, and we're lucky enough to have other members of the research group here. So if there were any case specific questions, I might be able to involve them in answering some of these as well. Should I stop the screen share now, Mousami?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And thank you, Sango, for such an insightful talk. I think it has really raised the curtain to many complex issues that do not find place in the environment assessment reports that are prepared prior to making of such projects. So thank you for that. And I now open the floor to the questions.
Hello, if nobody else is going to jump in, maybe I could just throw in a quick question for Sango and the team. Thanks, Sango, for a very interesting presentation. I really look forward to reading the, is it an article or a book?
It's an article and it's under review.
Right, almost feels like a book. There's so much in there. Maybe just to begin, maybe you could talk about how your approach is built on or expanded on or is different from Lund, who was so focused on property rights.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think the main point of difference from Christian's work is kind of broadening the scope of the idea of rupture to look kind of more broadly at sort of nature-society interactions. And I think the other thing is kind of expanding how we think about rupture in temporal terms, because I think he kind of follows this idea of like specific events or moments in time that bring about a shift in institutions or political configurations in some way. So really, I think it's in terms of the scope of how we're using it and kind of aspects of the temporality around it. I think he also, he uses it kind of methodologically, I guess, as a window into understanding, like when you, I think his approach in that 2016 paper is to the idea that in a moment of rupture, institutions are exposed and you can understand how they're actually ticking, that kind of idea. So we're kind of using it a bit differently as well in that sense.
I can just jump in and ask you another question, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Reading him, he had the sense that institutions were going to fundamentally rupture, whereas I think we look back historically, his article on Indonesia, they didn't actually rupture. They really resettled back into very similar sorts of path dependencies. To what degree do you see that playing out in your cases? Are there path dependencies that are going to be reasserted, or are there actual real ruptures?
Yep. Okay. Well, I might kick off on that, and I'll invite any of my colleagues to chip in if they have thoughts to add. I guess that's what we're sort of getting at with this notion of the generative potential involving kind of this exchange of, expressions of agency, but that can also be met by a reassertion of existing institutions and power relations. And in a way, like what I feel is that it depends on the moment of time that you're looking at it. So if looking back at that case of the Indigenous land claim in Kebal Rumia, if we went in there at the beginning of 2020 thinking, wow, this is amazing. They're trying to kind of claim 7,500 hectares, which is quite a large area of land in Cambodian terms. It was quite an impressive claim on their part from a situation where they were about to be evicted from these lands. But then, a few months on, you're seeing kind of the paring back of that claim, the reassertion of power by the province and other state actors. And so to me, it's kind of, there are sort of moves to kind of reassert existing power relations and existing institutions, definitely. And so I think it's really this kind of state of flux that I've seen, certainly in my research on that. I don't know if others would like to add to that, perhaps Keith or Phil or whoever else is here, Sarah and Phuc.
Yeah, from my side, I guess, well, we have lots of discussions on this within our team as well. So it's not necessarily representing a consensus view here, but
exactly.
My sense is that there is sort of a transformative change that has been taking place with things like hydropower resettlement, and it kind of invokes this idea of a way of life that has slipped into the past that's no longer possible, right? So, a way of life living alongside a broadly ecologically functional river system. They're still the same, well, they're older now, there's still villagers there, but their location has moved, they're now in sort of resettlement sites, and our relationship with the natural environment has gone through a transformative change, or a rupture, I think. And I think part of that is also their sort of tighter incorporation into relationships with the state and relationships with markets as well. So I would sort of identify personally, a dramatic sort of shift in nature-society relations that can be marked as a rupture.
Okay,
Or if
thank you.
anyone else would like to add, or perhaps we could go to another question.
Yes, I think we have Evelyn Go with her hand raised.
Hi, Evelyn.
Hi, Sango, Keith, Phil. Again, with apologies, because I'm not, I'm coming on to this from left field, as it were. As you know, I don't work exactly in your area, but I see the project as a really interesting intervention on the question of change in society-nature relations. And coming off the back of where Keith's remarks went just now, to me, your application of rupture to this issue of society-nature relationships is most compelling, simply because of, again, what Keith has just said, that your cases do illustrate with so much potential and compelling detail, right, the ways in which we can access elements of that rupture, right? So part of this is just a preface by saying this is wonderful. I think you've got a lot to offer. And my question was actually about, ironically, I'm a very rusty geographer, so please excuse the lack of terminology, but I see the emphasis on the temporal elements, obviously, because you're dealing with change. But I wondered if there was a sort of really equally interesting spatial element to your study as well. I mean, you've got these amazing case studies across a range of quite different political economies and societies. And yeah, are you managing to get any sort of leverage out of the spatial dimensions of the rupture or these ruptures? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, so I think in the spatial realm, I guess the main way we've been, like, based on our empirical work, we've sort of been looking at interactivity within landscapes in terms of change processes and how those serve to kind of intensify rupture. But then the other aspect of our analysis, I guess, is scalar, which is kind of what I was also signaling there. I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know if any of the others would like to chip in on this. I mean, it's a generative question to think further on. I guess at a broad level, I think it's these scalar interactions that seem to kind of intensify, the spatial interactions that seem to intensify kind of the impacts of things like a dam, right? So I guess that's one way in which we're thinking about it. But again, I think it varies between the cases a bit. And as Keith said, we might have slightly different lenses on this. So if anyone else would like to chip in.
Yeah, I might just jump in there. I mean, something which we were interested in right from the beginning was the networked responses to what's going on at individual sites. And of course, this immediately takes us up in scale right across the region with networked civil society and other responses. But then, of course, the sort of pushback from authoritarian states. So it's an ongoing process. And this is also part of the temporality as things expand out in scale, but then over time. So there's, I guess, also moments of sort of profound optimism and then pessimism about the potential for the experience of rupture to generate responses. Even maybe Phuc, you might want to say more about this in Vietnam, the way in which not only the experience of Sen La Dam, which has a long history of I guess, discussion right up to the National Assembly, but then also the more recent experience of displacement by rubber, which goes hand in hand with the experience felt by those affected whom Sango talked about. So I think that this is also, it also responds in part, I think, to John, to your question about the sort of institutional response, whether things do change or simply revert back. And that there are times when through various networks responses to dams, but also to land grabbing and all sorts of other impositions on livelihoods, it seems that things there's all sorts of potentials and ways in which previously very isolated groups being affected by the project Sango's talked about are then brought into sort of wider networks, empowering networks, but then then a clamp down. I just saw just yesterday, I think Hun Sen released about several dozen activists who'd been arrested in the context of the having and other dams. And so there's it's kind of ongoing. And I think it depends on the moment and when you're looking at things, whether you see any real change or whether it seems to be plus ça change, going back to the way things were. But Phuc, maybe you might want to say something about the case in Sơn La and Hoa Binh.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thanks. Yes, I just want to provide a little bit of information related to the spatial dimension that Phil mentioned related to our case studies or in rubber plantation in Hoa Binh. So that was a small village displaced by the dam, and the government gave them some land, and then the land was taken by rubber company. And villagers protested. So Phil and I look into how people responded to this, and it's a kind of interesting dimension there. With the people protest, it's not only involving villagers themselves, but it jump scales, engaging, involving civil societies, activists, scientists, not only at the local level, but also at the national and regional level. So regional NGOs got villagers to a training camp in Thailand and provided villagers with some skills for how to deal with local authorities, for example. So we often, when we do when we look into this kind of study, we often focus very much on the locality. But I think in order to understand how people respond to that kind of intervention, we really need to go beyond that level, looking into who is involving in that. So again, in our case, response is really jump scale, going well beyond the local areas.
Thank you. So maybe just to bring that together, I think some of the key points were around kind of interactivity within landscapes, thinking about scale and also networks, I think, with other main areas coming through, Evelyn. But thank you for that question.
Okay, I think we have one in the chat by Deepika. Great work, Sango, Di, and everyone. And for everybody's knowledge, Di is a word that we use in India and in Hindi to address an elder sister. So I look forward to reading the paper. As you mentioned about the expression of agencies or power as described by Jane Scott in the form of resistance and non-compliance by the villagers. My question is, have you or the team come across the role of youth groups and local political leaders in such interactions and nature society transformations?
Okay, thanks, Deepika. That's a really good question. I guess the case that I've studied most deeply is the Lower Sesan 2, so maybe I'll speak from there. So I think some really key, and maybe I can pick up on Kat's question as well in that, because she was asking about what were some of the factors that brought people to kind of protest. So I think definitely in that case, actually the process of resettlement there kind of split the community between those who wanted to take the state resettlement package or the state company resettlement package and those who, they could no longer stay in the original village but wanted to kind of move onto their customary lands at the edge of the reservoir. And so first of all, there was kind of, I think, important to recognize this lack of kind of a consensus within the community. So we're not dealing with a uniform stance by any means. And then among the people that decided to stay, I guess my colleague Phuc and I have recently been sort of going back through that data and writing it up. We find this whole area of kind of that experience, the lived experience of rupture, as being quite an important area to think about. So sort of these threats to places that they valued and were important to them culturally, and as well as, you know, in terms of livelihoods and so on. And kind of the emotional response to that seemed like quite an important galvanizing force in that community. But it's also been kind of the target or been supported over the years by various kind of local through to regional NGOs. So those networks have been quite important there. At the same time, you have quite strong community leaders within that Penang community, and actually there it happens to be, you know, the official community leader is a woman who's kind of super energetic and really has a lot of community support. But it's, I think, because you ended up with a group of people that made that sort of joint decision to stay behind, that also created some cohesion within that community. And so they are very kind of motivated to work together on different things. So I would say it's a combination of kind of that, you know, the experience that they were going through, that their emotional sort of response to that, their networks and the resources that they could mobilize. I think overt politics is probably less, in, you know, formal politics in terms of party politics is not playing so much of a role in that particular community, although it may in other cases. So yeah, those are some of the factors that I've observed there. I think there'd be variations around the sites, but I think this area of kind of networks beyond the community are probably a common pattern, and kind of community cohesion around particular shared agendas might be another common pattern. And I guess I'm particularly interested in exploring kind of, you know, that experiential process, the experience of rupture and how that fits in with galvanizing action as well. And Sarah's adding, on the Arang Dam, this struggle did involve youth groups from Phnom Penh, and that was quite problematic as at times they displaced local Indigenous voices. Sarah, do you want to speak to that? Or is that it?
I don't mind. I think what you said, Sango, just about how there's always a unique constellation of people and factors and events that give rise to a certain kind of resistance. And in the Arang case, there was a unique combination of people on the ground who then networked in via Facebook to more urban networks and sentiments, and it created a different kind of resistance struggle to what we saw in Lower Sesame too.
And what about the role of the international activists there, Sarah? Do you want to talk about that?
Well, there was Alex, who was the founder of the Mother Nature NGO. Sango showed a slide of what's happened to some of those Mother Nature activists recently in Cambodia. He was a real mobilizer and a catalyst, I would say, but maybe a one-off because he's now been deported, and I don't think that Prime Minister Hun Sen would allow that kind of a struggle to happen again.
Thank you.
Can I add a little bit on the role of the youth group there in Vietnam case study? Yes, as Sango mentioned, different acts participated in the protest, but youth group plays a very big role in this because social media plays a huge role in pulling people together, in conveying messages with a broader audience. And youth group in our case study in Sela use smartphone with a social media tool, and they have been communicating using that instrument to communicate with each other and in reaching out to a broader group of people. So they play a huge role in this process. Yes, of course, then there are other groups participating in that, but yeah, the youth group plays a big role there.
Thank you. Yeah, social media, definitely an important actor in its own right now, yes. Or platform, certainly. Any other questions or thoughts?
Okay, Keith has one.
Okay, we can almost make this as a project meeting if just have a chat around some ideas. I was interested in well, I'll put you on the spot, I guess. You know, what's your take on the you know, the overall picture of Rupture, I suppose? I was noting that you mentioned ideas of a hydropower resource complex in Southeast Asia, which is an interesting term that Watts and Peluso have used in the past to talk about things like the oil palm complex in Indonesia or the extractive oil complex in Nigeria. So can we think of hydropower as a type of resource complex? And you know, what are the implications of this? Are these little mini ruptures adding up to a major rupture along the Mekong River, I suppose, is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might have been you that that put forward that idea in our paper, Keith. So I could very well turn that question back to you. But I do think that, you know, there is that map of the region that we were looking at. To me, it shows that you know, there are patterns of investment and development that are going on here that go beyond sort of that individual site, you know, project level impact and analysis. So I think it's important to look at that collectivity in a way. I guess, you know, in our work, we're not really conceptualizing what that complex looks like or what it means to call it a complex. I think that's probably outside of what we've been doing. But I think our intention, or my intention certainly in signaling that today, was that there's more than just kind of individual projects going on here. There's an accumulation of these mega infrastructure projects. Also, if you look at the other BRI investments, like why hydropower alone, like if you start to tally up some of these kind of rail and other projects that are going on, there's sort of an overall kind of pattern of infrastructure development and investment that, you know, I think adds up to more than the sum of its parts. Hyperobject, yes.
I'm just bouncing off this, you know, Timothy Morton stuff, where he actually talks about, you know, his example is things like climate change, but you know, it's referring to massive forces whose impacts defy our physical perception. So we can think about sort of huge dams as having so many transformative effects that are impossible to actually, you know, grasp from one person's individual point of view. So it seems like that's a pretty classic hyperobject. And he also goes on to say that, you know, I'm just saying this is for an idea maybe. He writes that the word hyperobject offers a useful shorthand for why threats like global warming are so difficult to understand or accept. They threaten our survival in ways that defy traditional modes of thinking about reality and humiliate our cognitive powers, a disorienting shift that sends many people reeling into superstition, polarization, and denial. So yeah, you know, it just seems off the top of my head that, you know, there's something kind of interesting there with thinking about the overall, you know, regional view of hydraulic infrastructure in the region, and what are the, you know, just the transformative effects that it has, and how can we think about that?
Definitely, but would you limit it to kind of the hydraulic infrastructure? What about relationships to other sorts of infrastructure? Or do you think it's, you know, unique?
The Belt and Road Initiative as another hyper object. So I guess, you know, you have to sort of, it makes sense to think about, you know, particular areas as hyper objects, but yeah. Maybe the next project.
Right. Start work now. Mousami, I see we've hit 1:30 and people are having to leave. Should we wrap up there?
I think so. So we can just close the webinar here. Thank you, Sango, once again for a very insightful and thought-provoking talk. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here as well. It was really great to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Sango. Thanks, everyone.